All right, guys, this is the third and last session of the day. Let's meet the young entrepreneurs and eco-entrepreneurs, we should say. Let's meet Ludivine Berroir, the co-founder of Marula Protein Limited and Marula Creative Consultant. Next to her is Nat Manak, the CEO and founder of Nat Coff Ltd. And on our right, Ivy Were, CEO of CAFMAG Entreprise and founder of the Café Magnifico. Welcome, ladies. Well surrounded to finish this day, my dear Dean.
Great to have you with us, and thank you everyone for joining this session, which I'm going to say that a little bit off the record is always every year the highlight of the whole event. And in fact, this year we're spoiled because we have a next generation panel this evening, and as if that weren't enough, we have another one tomorrow morning at 10:30, which I wanted to put a little bit of a plug in for that. I think it's been developed between the Next Gen team and also very much supported by Sustainable Harvest David. And I know we've got a whole bunch of Next Gen origin women leaders to talk to us about the evolving landscape of sustainability connected to our world of opportunities. So make sure you put that in your diary, 10:30 to 11:30 tomorrow morning. The only drawback with that panel is I won't be moderating it, which may or may not be a reason for turning up, but I'm looking forward to sitting in the audience and enjoying it with you. So before we jump into this one, let me also do a shout out to you, Judith, and thank you for all of your work and all of your ideas and your energy to bring a really fascinating theme. I think this whole idea of not just the next gen, but generation restoration. I love the energy of that. I love the possibility of that. I love the opportunity in that. I'm really looking forward to digging into this discussion, but I really want to make sure that we just tribute you for the idea and the concepts and organizing all of this. I'm bringing together such an exciting panel for us to discuss. So before we jump in, I mean, let's just take a little of a jump back and think through what the different elements of restoration are. So you're all getting used to the app now, and given that we're in the next gen, it's going to be no problem at all. You're all digital natives. So there's an opportunity to do some polling, because we want to really get a sense from you of what we think the opportunities are for the world. What are the global gains of this concept of restoration? And the good news on this poll, according to my speaker notes here, is we are allowed to select more than one, but we've got a range of different options there you'll see on the app. Climate mitigation and adaptation, the economic issues that we face, food security, which came up, I think, in some earlier discussion as well, water supply, health, biodiversity. So have a look at that, start to think through what you think the opportunities are for us in the global gains of restoration already. I love watching these build. It's so exciting, so interesting. And obviously climate mitigation, adaptation is a theme that we've had really throughout the day, even from Cyril's word cloud of this morning right the way through. It's been kind of with us as a theme. But really, I mean, this is interesting, isn't it? It's not like one thing is jumping out. Restoration has got many, you can see it all okay? You can see it here on the screen. It's got many facets. So it's not like we're going to say, oh, it's only about climate, or it's only about food security. It's a very all-encompassing and comprehensive approach. And when I was preparing for our discussion, I was also thinking through what is the definition of the word restoration, which is quite interesting. And the definition that I came up with in the dictionary is the action of returning something to a former condition. And I think it'd be quite interesting in our discussion to think through the difference between sustainability, which I think some commentators might say is about sort of a maintenance or a kind of steady state. I know that's not what everyone thinks, but and this action of restoring something. So it's almost like a rebuilding and a restoration and a revitalization. So I'd like to get into that. And I think we've got an excellent panel to start the conversation. And what we're going to do is I'm going to ask each of you in turn just to take a few minutes to tell us a bit about your restoration story. And we'll go in the order that is on the slide here. And I think we've got a slide for each of you. So if we could, Ludivine, maybe start with you and tell us a little bit more about your story and the story of Marula and what you're doing, and just tell us about how you see that's connected to this idea of restoration.
All right, hi everyone. My name is Ludivine. I'm originally French. And my journey in coffee started in 2017 when we pitched a marketing project to JDE. And the idea was to film a coffee documentary to help the employees at the company understand what the journey of coffee was like on the ground and see how they could understand their sustainability projects. And to be honest, the project has now become something very different to how it started, and it's been an amazing journey. And as we were filming this documentary, what I'd like to share today is the journey of one of our companies called Protein. And so when we were filming coffee farmers in Uganda, we realized that many farmers were still relying on the term monocropping, which I'm sure everybody is very familiar with, and we're looking at now how can we diversify income sources, how can we diversify a farm on the ground. And so that's when we found that many farmers who were actually successful were using chicken on the side of coffee. And so coffee is an annual source of income that could pay them the school fees, but coffee had a sort of, chickens had a sort of monthly income that they could rely on for their income sources. And so obviously being a marketeer and not a coffee person, I went back a month later wanting to take photos for JDE to show my genius chicken idea. And when I went back to see the chicken, there were no more chicken on the farms, which obviously was quite an issue for my marketing report. And so we started asking farmers more about, what happened to the chicken and how come there's no more chicken on their coffee farms. And that's when we understood that there was a huge problem in the feed industry in Uganda. So feed prices were going up. Most farmers were relying on silverfish, which is a small fish from the lake in Uganda, and obviously low quality mixed with sand, etc., etc. And so we realized, okay, is there a solution that could be made with feed, and how can we provide farmers with a sort of, price and quality interesting feed? And so at the same time, my co-founder Tommy was reading an article about a company in South Africa that was transforming organic waste into animal feed and organic fertilizer. And that's when we heard about the wonderful insect called black soldier fly. And so since then, I'm sure I'll get into it in further questions, but since then we've been using the black soldier fly to produce animal feed for farmers. And interestingly enough, everything has come full circle because now we realize that the organic fertilizer is also a huge opportunity. And so we've been prototyping that fertilizer with many coffee companies. And so in a way, 5 years later, everything has come full circle. Yeah.
Great. Before we move on, because there's a couple of interesting things there, and again, you know how to use the app. I'm expecting lots of questions. We already have one question coming through, which is interesting, and we'll come on to that in a moment. But you mentioned that you're already starting to connect this innovation in terms of animal feed to some coffee companies. I'm not sure if that's confidential or whether you're allowed to share with us the kind of companies that are already connecting with you on this.
Yeah, no, not at all. So we have two main projects. So the main one is obviously we have 2 warehouses in Kampala, and with that we're producing, a professional feed and a professional fertilizer. And so we've been prototyping that with Ugakov, which is the Ugandan Sukafina arm on the ground, and we've had amazing results. I mean, the organic fertilizer has been more successful than the organic fertilizer that they've been importing, as well as actually the non-organic fertilizer, which I think is not something we initially expected. So that's been an amazing result, and we've been prototyping this for the past year. And obviously with the war and everything, then we realized that on the ground a reliable source of fertilizer that can be produced in country where it's actually going to be used is also a great opportunity. And on the other hand, we've also been prototyping a farmer project with the support of JDE, and that's been developing a sort of DIY kit, so a do-it-yourself kit, which essentially looks like a drum. I believe there's a photo here on the stage. Yeah. So the black drums that you see, so we've been prototyping this, and we've now worked with 1,300 young youth in Uganda who actually make their own feed and their own fertilizer using their own waste on farm. And so what we found is that this is an amazing opportunity for young farmers who maybe don't have access to land. So as many people probably know, in Uganda there's a big issue with land transferation and parents who don't trust their youth, with coffee farmers. So this is a way to give them a first step into, working on the farm, and for the parents to start trusting their kids and actually, providing an input that's really important for the farm's success. And what's also amazing is this is about €4 for them to buy this kit. Okay. And with that they get, if they use their own waste, they actually get free fertilizer and free feed.
Excellent, great. Let's dig into the economics of that maybe in a bit, but let's keep the introductions running. We've got next Natalie. Could you tell us a bit about your story, how you ended up joining us on Generation Restoration this evening?
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you, SCTA, to having me. I've been applying almost 10 years to get a ticket here. I remember I was even going to SCTA office to ask to get permission when I was still a startup baby. And actually now I made it on panel, so I'm very happy. I also
Very welcome.
would love to start with, before I'm talking about my person and our project, about resilience. It was a key word, and I think it's sustainability was a buzzword, and now the next one, resilience, might become a buzzword. And for me, in short, because nobody spoke concretely, what is resilience? Resilience was today. I had my iWatch, and actually instead of 10,000 feet or steps, I did 20,000 because simply there is a general strike, la grève in Genève. So this is resilience, when you go beyond what is expected and add up to what makes you stronger. So just maybe a short introduction about ourselves and about our project. My name is Nat, I'm French-Swiss, and I'm based in Myanmar. Maybe not very known to everyone, it's also called Burma, in the middle of a sandwich called India and China, big power, so geostrategically extremely important. How did I end up there? I've been trading for Volcafe before, and later I asked my trader neighbors what's happening with Myanmar, Burma. It's opening up 2015, were the first democratic elections. Is there any coffee? And in fact, it proved that this country's got very little coffee, extremely little coffee. And that was exactly the motivation for us, which goes into what can we do from zero to hero, and how can we do that? So Nat Coffee, together with our two partners from Singapore and a local Burmese partner, we were looking into an origin in the west of the country, which was neglected over 60 years. Burma, isolated 60 years under military dictatorship. There was coffee before in the late 1990s, late 1890s, but basically everybody forgot how to grow coffee. And we wanted to step into this untapped potential by bringing new varieties to a region which was fully unknown. So how did we do that? There was wild coffee at this origin, and together with Fair Wild Foundation based in UK, we found some and detected some wild varieties which we are currently breeding with local varieties in terms to produce a new variety which is climate resilient. Day by day, and I'm living in Myanmar, I see producers struggling with climate change. Instead of using new varieties, they tend to add more shade trees. But in fact, if there is a new variety, we would be more efficient and the yield, of course, growing. So this is one of our projects. The second is we built Chinlite, which is a producing group of young entrepreneurs. And we should not forget that half of the world population is in Asia, and half of the world population is 25 to 35. So demographics are very interesting in this region. And so together with this young power, we created a group and produced coffee. We were exporting 5 years, mainly to Korean markets. And suddenly, 1 year ago, revolution happened and everything just cracked down. I'm here now. Before going back to Myanmar, I'm quite hopeful that we can continue with resilience with our projects, which we are already started to work on. And actually, I'm very happy to have the audience because you complete us on the panel, and actually also to get the support for such a very difficult mission in this almost unknown country called Myanmar. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Natalie. Really interesting. Lots of questions already formulating, I'm sure, certainly in my mind, and I guess also in our audience. But before we do that, let's finish our introductory comments by getting your story, Ivy. Thank you for being with us, and perhaps you could tell us a bit more about what you've been doing at Café Magnifico.
Thank you very much, SCTA and the ITC, because through their collaboration, I'm here. And this proves that the Ghanaian coffee sector is not as lost as we all thought it would be, and then all the work I'm doing is actually paying off. So yes, Cafe Magnifico is a brand that is founded by and I'm a processor certified by SCTA, and I discovered the Robusta coffee in Ghana in 2015. I actually was in the fashion business, and on one of my trips to my markets in Turkey, they wanted to do something else than the fashion, and they asked me to go back and look for a commodity that we could trade in. And when I visited one of the farming communities in Ghana, where I actually have a cooperative now, smallholder farmers, I realized that they didn't have sustainability, and their livelihoods was very bad, because we all know Ghana is a cocoa-known country. So the coffee was kind of on the backlog and neglected for decades. The last time we internationally exported coffee was in the 50s. So being patriotic enough, I decided to jump into the production of coffee and to provide sustainability for the coffee farmers that I've been working with. And so far, I've been able to create a seamless chain whereby through increase in innovative products that I've created to create the coffee culture in the country, because predominantly I'm selling within only Ghana for now, looking to export and create more blends with the Robusta from Ghana. My products are 7, so I'm trying to increase the coffee culture and to be able to raise up my turnovers in order to be able to make profits in the business. So my mission is to increase the consumption of coffee locally, because Ghana is a tea country. We are British ruled, so we do more of tea and then cocoa. But interestingly, it's not been bad. From roasting 250 kg when we started to 2 tons, just selling locally, I think we've done tremendously well in the sector, and we are a well-known brand. So that's been our story so far, and we're looking to cross greater heights and increase our awareness of the Ghanaian Robusta across the world.
Excellent. Thank you. Yeah. Well, all of you, thank you. Thank you for sharing your stories, and thank you for being here with us. Before, I've got a few other questions which I'd like to ask, specifically to your various experiences, but there's already a kind of existential question that's come from the audience around this idea of restoration. And, the question is that, in a way, is restoration possible given the size and the growth of the human population? What do the panelists think about the difference between restoring to an original state or an original condition, which was the definition I shared, compared with evolving or creating a future state that is going to support our future needs? So in terms of the work that each of you is doing, how do you see what you're learning as being something which is not just about like going back to like where we were, but going forward to do something different that's going to preempt the needs? So maybe I'll just go, start with you again, Ludivine, just to kind of get a bit of a sense of what you're learning and what you think is interesting around the work that you're doing that is going to help shape the future rather than go back to the past.
Yeah, I think you touched on many interesting parts. I would say, all in all, what we've learned from our work with smallholder farmers, let me speak for that first. I think a new way has definitely to be created. I think smallholder farmers in Uganda will rely on the exporters to bring certain innovations, certain loyalty programs, certain projects for them to feel helped. What we've tried to do with this recent project is really empower youth first and foremost in their own farms and create a tool where they can actually develop their own products. And I think that's something that's very interesting and hasn't necessarily been done before. The DIY kits that we produce, as I mentioned, so to explain just the innovation in itself, maybe so it's also clear with every other answer that I might give in the future. The black soldier fly is a fly, and we have love cages, and in those love cages, the flies produce babies, as we call them, and those babies can then feed on any type of organic waste. So it can be pineapple, it can be food waste that they have at their own, but it can also be coffee husks, it can also be coffee water waste, for example, and so after that waste for 14 days, the larvae will grow, and then that larvae can then be processed, can either be sort of fed to the chicken like this, as the normal worms that they should be eating in the first place, and that chicken eats from the ground, or actually processed into a powder which can be sold. And then the byproduct is an organic fertilizer, so it's a sort of faster composting model than just leaving waste to compost by itself. And then that waste sort of fertilizer can then be reintegrated into their farms. So yeah, I think I would say let's not go back, let's rather learn from the past and create a new, better way.
And has that been, I mean, just for me to be clear, when you talk about this, I mean, it's a broadest sense of the word technology. It's a biotechnology, or
Yes.
it's a utilization of ecosystem services to create a range of different value-add products, the feed for the animals, the organic fertilizer. Is that pioneering? Has that been done before? Is this the first time that that's been done?
No, it's been done before. It started in South Africa. It's an insect that's naturally from the equator. There are many companies in Europe that are doing this. A famous one close to here in France is called Y Insect. They've raised a lot of money, but there's some in Asia as well. And Thailand is one of the biggest producers of this insect. But of course, there it has to be very high tech. It has to be temperature controlled. Here, the way that we're doing it is saying this insect is actually from the equator, so we don't need all of this fancy extra things. It can be done at a small hub level. It can be done at a farmer's level. It can be done at an exporter level, and it's much more interesting economically.
But first time in coffee?
First time in coffee? I would say so, unless somebody here has heard of another project. I do know they've been prototyping this in Rwanda as well.
Okay.
And so that's where the link with Yugakov originally came from, because they were already trying to do this in Rwanda, and so that's how the two projects link together.
Yeah.
You talked about the technology. I do want to say that the factory level is a sort of high-tech version, and so what we've tried to do is, with the farmers, we originally gave them a love cage. We asked them to do the breeding. We had this whole fancy setup, and then we realized, that's just not going to work. A farmer has a lot of things to do. They sometimes have another job. You can't expect them to have the same type of research that we have. Every time we learn something, you would have to redo trainings. So that just wasn't the efficient way to do it. And so what we've done now is we sort of decentralize. And so we have breeding hubs close to where the farmers are, so that the farmers can just buy the baby larvae from us directly, and then their cycle is much shorter. It's only a 14-day cycle.
Got it. And I'm going to come afterwards also to kind of dig in a little bit to each of you as to your own business model. So I can understand the value add to the smallholder producers and to farmers, but you also need to be sustainable economically. So I'll be quite intrigued to hear a bit from you about how that's working. But before we do, Natalie, your thoughts on kind of restoration as a proactive shaping of the future rather than a kind of back to the past in the work that you're doing.
The past, can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you.
The past is too far away. In Asia, presence is key. I guess we can't even remember how coffee was produced in Myanmar back in 1890. So there are the generation who experience coffee is not longer here. Therefore, we have to create our own normatives. When we talk about yes, producers, but producers are not any longer simply producers. They're also roasters. They're also trainers, barista. And that's where the Asian, or yes, let's say the Asian coffee continent goes to. We look at a more holistic way of inclusion along the coffee value and supply chain, being versatile to change from producer to roaster and back. I'd love to just share one compelling story, because I think we sometimes also have to talk concrete. I came across with a young man, he's in his mid-30s, Chinese ethnic, lives in the valley of rubies, ruby and jade, big precious stones over there. And actually, he decided to go into mobile business, selling mobile phones. With this, he accumulated profit, quite a good amount, and he decided to set up his own roastery. When he set up his own roastery, he started roasting himself, and he approached Nat Coffee in asking, would we be able to enhance direct trade and introduce to local producers? And so we actually, peer-to-peer, young, 25 to 30, meet each other, and they're rethinking, reshaping value chain. How can we work together? And what we've seen is actually a flip-flopping from roastering back to origin and forward. So exchange program or exchange moments between the two. This can be happening also between trainers and baristas. So this is a vice versa possibility. Just to let you know that the actors in Myanmar are versatile, agile, and can actually move and have different hats, which is really important for the future, also for the traders in the floor. No longer speak only to producers, but also roasters or who have the two hats.
Yeah, interesting. So even within a relatively, let's say, early stage coffee production country like Myanmar, you're already seeing a level of versatility and innovation around not just producing, but also, if I understood correctly, training to be baristas as well as roasters. And yeah, that's a very fast trajectory. And I'd be interested also in each of you telling us a bit about the domestic market opportunity in the various countries that you represent, because you, Ivy, touched on that before. But before coming to that, maybe just to come back to this question for you, it doesn't sound like there's much to return back to, because Ghana is a cocoa producing country predominantly, is a tea drinking country predominantly. So what you're building is shaping something new by definition, right? So, and how are you finding that's being received in the country, either by the farmers who take that risk, or by generally the media, or how is it kind of resonating and gaining attention?
That's true. With the Ghanaian coffee sector, restoration is for both front end and back end, just like you mentioned. Like I said, the last time we exported coffee was in the 50s. So the farmers I discovered in 2015 were farmers that had old coffee trees they had been tenderizing for decades. So, and in the coffee sector, there's a formalized way of supporting the farmer, giving them amenities, capacity training, and all that. So the cocoa farmer, it's more of a, let's say, a first wife. So the coffee farmers have been left for a very long time, and they have just been doing their own farm practices with what they can access. So the restoration that Café Magnifico has given back into the coffee sector, the small farm holders we've been dealing with, in collaboration with Ghana Cocoa Board, which has the mandate to actually deal with cocoa and coffee, and then the Cocoa Research Institute of Ghana. And now the most interesting one is ITC, International Trade Center, coming on board to collate all this and then give the coffee farmer a sustainable livelihood by providing crops that are resilient to pests and diseases, and giving clones that would increase yield, capacity trainings that would increase our quality of our green bean. So there's a lot that we're doing currently to restore the Ghanaian coffee sector to what it was and even more in the 50s, and also to join the fight of bringing Robusta into the international market, because Robusta in the front end, as a roaster and as a trader, it's not been easy. So Robusta also has to be restored and given equal field to play in the international market.
I love that. I love that story. And in fact, your last point, when you just, in a very simple way, you said has not been easy. I'm sure it has not been easy. And in fact, the next question we had from the audience is, and maybe we can start with you, Ivy, and work backwards along the panel, is, what have the main challenges been? So what have you found to be the hurdles on the main challenges in the restoration of these different innovations, whether that's in a certain, producing origin, or whether that's in a certain approach, as you were setting out, Ludivine? Because obviously, and the other point that the question asks is because there's probably competition, or there are other people trying to do similar things. So, Ivy, what have been the main challenges, and maybe what have you learned personally, individually, as a consequence?
The main challenge I had when I ventured into the sector, there was no data nor information about what the sector entails. It was just something, a bean I discovered, and I had friends who were interested in it, and I got interested in it. And my other business was going bad, and then that was the only information I had. So the information I had was the only one I was able to travel to discover. But as in what it entails to be in the sector, I wasn't privy to that. At Cocoa Board, they have a lot of information about cocoa and being the processor of chocolate and all that, and trading in the cocoa sector. But in the coffee sector, they didn't have no data. They didn't have no, even the feasibility of how much is being produced, what is the sector like. There was no information. So we, the new producers, just plunged in with no data and access to finance, because you're plunging in with no data. No bank is going to give you no money. You have to work with your own money or have some angel investors who believe in your character and your passion. And one other challenge I incurred was farmer relation. It was, because the sector has been neglected, the farmer was not interested in believing you are coming to, you're going to give him a streamline of turnover for his produce for the year. Because he used to sell his produce across borders.
Okay.
So he didn't have to sell to a producer in Ghana. He used to have to travel. And you know, farmers are used to one streamline of activity. Once they've passed this path and it's good for them, they want to be there.
Yeah.
So when I got into the business as a processor, and then I went to collate them in order to be able to have their produce at the end of the year, it was difficult to convince the farmer and assure the farmer I was going to be there to off-take his product.
Yeah.
That's one of the challenges I faced.
Yeah, so trust, really, trust and confidence that there was going to be a longer-term relationship, because if they were going to take a risk, they needed that reassurance that there were. And you did that without any contractual paperwork?
No, it was word of mouth, and then I seed capital.
Okay,
Yes.
interesting. Yeah, and I want to come back to talk a bit about finance, and I also want to make sure that we use the fact that you're in this event with a lot of bigger organizations that will be very interested, I think, in the work that you're doing and whether there are opportunities to connect. But Natalie, maybe I just come to you next in terms of what you've learned, maybe also for yourself as an individual entrepreneur. What have you taken away from that, and how has that changed your approach?
Very interesting, because what she's saying is, I could say, could come from my own mouth. Actually, we face the same situation that farmers in Myanmar 2015, after 60 years of isolation, were not keen to sell or produce because simply there was no market or a local market. So first of all, I had to convince them to produce with a good variety. Secondly, to sell. Actually, nobody wanted to sell, even though they had coffee. But the way of hoarding in an isolated country such as rubies or jade was replicated in coffee. So how can you really convince a producer to sell? And he has absolutely no idea of a market price. There was no market at that time, or no consciousness about market price at all. So there is a lot of education work. We had to do capacity building almost 5 years. And now after 5 years, we are actually ready to export, and revolution and the political environment has cracked down everything. So what I learned is that instead of actually stepping back and switching to another origin, which we might do to complete and to survive, we'll be continuously looking into this really big headache called Myanmar, and stay there with our pioneer role in 2015 to look into the long term and be part of what I called the term Asianizing. Asianizing means that coffee is there, currently stuck because of the political reasons and the strikes in the supply chain post-COVID. So we got plenty of coffee. And somehow this coffee has to be used, and so it's going to be sold to the sub-region.
Yeah.
We should remember that trade, inter-Asian trade, is bigger than the world trade itself. So it's growing very fast, and we would tend to look to the neighbor to sell the coffee, or of course to keep it, no headache, no buying, selling, just keep it in the local market.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I do want to come back to this domestic consumption opportunity as well, because it strikes me that that could be really interesting in the countries we're talking about. But Ludivine, just in terms of your own experiences, what have you learned as an entrepreneur, as a pioneer? You know, all the risk and the challenge of doing new things. Tell us, what have you learned about yourself and about the work that you're doing?
Yeah, so I think like any young company or entrepreneur, you face many obstacles. Doesn't really matter where you are or which industry you're in. I think when you're trying to innovate, yeah, there will always be many types of obstacles. I think in Uganda specifically, so our model relies on a certain input. And so for every 10 kilograms of waste, we can create about 3 kilograms of fertilizer. And for every kilogram of fertilizer, we produce 5 kilograms of CO2 equivalent. And so in order for this entire circular, model to happen and for us to be able to pitch, we had many times where we would promise a certain amount of fertilizer to a company or a certain amount of feed, and then we would have issues with our main input, which is the waste. And so when we originally started this, we prototyped with the Kampala City Capital Authority. But of course, you realize that actually you're in a country that doesn't have the infrastructure to actually sort that waste, and they're relying on one main landfill, to produce. So obviously they're very interested in your solution. So I think many of the obstacles were, how do you manage a startup in an environment where you definitely need the government support in order to do anything, and you can't do anything without the government support. And so now they really rely on our solution. But on the other hand, also, how do you balance the fact that when the government says, the truck will be there tomorrow and it doesn't come? And so you're here and your larvae require waste to survive, and otherwise, your larvae. Another funny story was when COVID happened at 10 p.m., we were told that there would be no transport.
Okay.
But, we have living creatures in our warehouse. And so how do we get the staff and so we had to bring all of our flies in an hour in a truck to a different prototype facility where all of our staff were staying. And so, many sustainability programs will talk about, oh, no corruption, no this, but what do you do when you have an entire warehouse full of flies that you've been building for 2 years, and suddenly a government says, sorry, no more trucks. So, there's been a lot of obstacles like that where you have to balance, I would say, private sector, public sector. And so I think what we've learned today is to sort of create a balance between that. And so that's really where this coffee project started again. So we are looking at, how can we include the coffee sector and the actual coffee waste that is being produced, and how can we rely on a private sector waste input for our program. So what we're really looking at now is, can we create carbon neutral coffee? Mm-hmm. Can we work with washing stations in Uganda, and can they give us their coffee, waste as well as the water, so not just the husk but also the wastewater? And can we provide our innovation so that the waste itself doesn't have to move, but can we bring our innovation where the waste is? I think that has been one of the main learnings. So you don't have to rely on this sort of crazy transport system.
Well, I tell you what strikes me just listening to all of you is the word I would use is resourcefulness. Yeah. You all are very resourceful. It's like, and in this kind of combination of startup or going to origins that are not yet fully developed, where you have a lot of pioneering work to do, you need to access resources. And I think different ways you've mentioned either government support or then lack of support, or in the case of Myanmar, a complete regime change with all of the pressures of that, or angel investors, I think you mentioned. It's almost like this agility to see what's out there, what can I do that can support my mission. And if I go back to what Carol was saying on an earlier panel today around blended finance, which can seem very high level and very conceptual, are you finding it possible, or how are you managing the process of raising the kind of finance that you need to take the risk and to invest in either the origins or in the farmer support or the technology or whatever it might be? So any one of you want to just kind of start by just sharing a little bit the upsides and maybe some of the worse experiences or the more disappointments that you've had in securing access to capital for your growth? Natalie, do you want to kick it off?
Well, when we started, we had a new product which was very small and unknown. The product later on became myself and our company, also called Nat Coffee. People started identifying themselves when I'm talking about people, mainly roasters. So roasters at the end of the chain gain trust and confidence to invest into an origin, which is extremely difficult, risk at 99%. And I believe that this was the only way to secure finance, pre-finance, contracting 1-2 years ahead in order to be able to be on the ground and implement our work. Then another important part, but less and less important in Asia, is the work and the role of a non-profit organization or even development agencies. Usually we just try to take the straight way in direct trade and check whether roasters, our customers, will be able to engage. And I think that's great. Thank to our roasters in the end that I will go back next week and be able to look into the next adventure. It's not clear whether I get out the coffee from this origin now. Big risk, but we will make it.
But that's interesting. So in a sense, what you're saying is the commitment of an end customer, of a roaster, is helping you either. Is it a prepayment, or it's just the knowledge that you've got a customer that allows you to unlock or to make the investment? Is that really what you're saying? Which is,
it's going beyond just a prepayment. It's a premium for Fair Wild certified coffee. So it goes into a long-term engagement, which looks more likely an investment in the end.
I got it. Because it's also very differentiating for the end roaster as well. If they get, they can secure a supply of something which is quite an exotic and unusual, a new kind of origin. And again, linking back to the point we've discussed in this conference before, continuing this origin diversification so that it's not, the sort of concentration of supply that we've seen from certain bigger producing countries. Maybe similarly in Ghana, Ivy, I mean, how have you mentioned angel investors, and you said, I think the way you framed it was that investors who were prepared to back you because of your character and your trust, which is putting a lot of yourself into the deal, right?
Indeed.
So, tell us a bit about your experiences there.
Yes, in Ghana, I started with the angel investors and my own seed capital from my previous business, because I had to consolidate that completely and then reinvest in the coffee sector. So, and I've been in the business for 7 years. So in the last 5 years, I've been working with angel investors. And in the last 2, the government has come in, but not directly. There's this youth entrepreneurship program that the government has been running, and they give out grants, and I've been a beneficiary twice. So that is one of our last capital injection in the business was actually from the grant, which is going to be used for expansion works.
Okay.
But for the banks, we approached one of our account holding banks, but the interest rate is high, and 2, I'm still selling locally, so it's on credit terms.
Yeah.
So the repayment won't be forthcoming, so we are not bankable enough for a loan from the financial sector of Ghana. But for now, the grants that we've received from the government and then my angel investors has been predominantly where my finance has been from.
Understood. Very clear. Thanks, Ivy. Ludwig, anything to add in terms of your own experience around access to capital and growth capital for your venture?
Yeah, so I think when you're bringing a new innovation, it's always hard for someone to back you up, especially if they don't know if this is actually going to work. So, in terms of our company, we're extremely grateful to JDE for having allowed us to, prototype that first innovation with the idea, that if more companies did that and you invest in 3 or 4 innovative projects, then maybe one of those will actually be extremely impactful, and it's not about all 4, working out. We also received a grant from the Dutch government, RVO, which I believe they do a lot in terms of, food security or innovation in agriculture, and, also having a grant when you don't feel the risk of having to pay back a loan or having to put your own money, I think it also gives an entrepreneur, the opportunity to actually really innovate and not feel that risk personally, and therefore take the wrong decisions that won't actually necessarily, benefit the business. In terms of moving forward, I think what we're really looking at, I mentioned that for every kilogram of fertilizer, we create 5 kilograms of CO2 equivalent. And so what we're really looking at now is, who is that coffee partner that can actually take this as an innovation and prototype with us on the ground and be our partner of choice. So we're not necessarily looking at an investment, but more of a partnership. And I think that would be a great opportunity, both for us as a company, but also the coffee sector. And second, also carbon credits. I think companies have a responsibility if you are creating too many not
Emissions,
emotions. How can you bring that back to startups and to entrepreneurs that are actually trying to do the right thing? And how can you balance that sort of financing that we don't necessarily have access to and that you have too much of?
I love that approach. And the emissions reduction that you've got by using your alternative fertilizer, is that something which is accredited in the science-based targets or the IPCC? Can we talk about that as an official certifiable reduction or removal to help with emissions, or?
So not yet,
but
if a coffee partner takes us on, then
there we go.
Yes.
Guys. Okay, straight after this panel, right? So look, there's 2 more really interesting questions that have come through. One of them I'm going to ask you to finish on in a moment, which is going to be the question that perhaps you would expect, but where do you see yourselves as individual entrepreneurs or eco-entrepreneurs or ecopreneurs and coffee entrepreneurs as well in 5 to 10 years' time? So, but also your organization is clearly associated with that. But before we do that, one of the things that I think is interesting, I had this in mind as someone's asked this question. When we have a conversation like this, it feels very different to the other conversations that we have in an event like this. We're talking, of course, about big organizations that, if they make a shift towards sustainability or some policy decisions that are enacted by the Swiss government, has an enormous impact in the world because of the scale of those organizations. But the way this is, phrased as a question is, let's explore really the space for these smaller initiatives which have a more immediate and direct impact than the typical, and it's inverted commas, official sustainability project. So kind of contrasting that. I like the question, and I'd be kind of, interested to get your view on how the work that you're doing, why it's so important to have that as a counterpoint to some of these really big kind of multinational type initiatives. Because my feeling is, without giving you the answer, my answer is you need both, of course. We all need to be moving towards restoration, regeneration, and sustainability. But there's a different energy and there's a different direct impact. So could you just give me a bit of a sense of how you think your work plays into the sort of total transition and why it's important as distinct to some of the bigger platforms that we've been discussing on earlier panels today? Maybe I start with you, Ludivine, and we work back.
Complex questions.
It is. Sorry if I made it sound more complex than it is, but
no, I think in terms of the corporate strategy, obviously, in terms of now, I'll not speak as a coffee expert, but rather I think as a young gen and a generation that cares about where her products come from and the responsibility that companies have to play in climate change, and topics that we are worried about as a generation. I would say, as a corporate, you do need to have a strategy. It doesn't work when you have a big corporate that, I don't know, is in the drinks business and then suddenly says they opened a school in Ghana. Like, what does that have to do with your, strategy? So I think as a corporate, you do have to understand, where do you create impact and where are the areas that you need to be mitigating risk. And so I think that's where carbon credits, where, incredibly projects that are actually on the ground that have to do with your own value chain really play a role. And then you also have opportunities, obviously. So this might be country of origins areas where you actually, care about the development of the origin, even if it's not necessarily directly related to your own operation. So yeah, I definitely think there needs to be both. In terms of sustainability programs, I mean, when we first started and we looked at JDE's olive projects, I remember coming back and saying, all of these projects only have old farmers. And so we were looking at, even if you fix the entire coffee supply chain and all of these farmers have great projects and 5 years later I come back and everything's worked, but like, what about the youth? This is all going to be lost in 10 years. Yeah. So it doesn't really matter if you don't involve the youth. So I think that would definitely be my main takeaway. No matter where you are in the value chain or no matter what the strategy is, how do you ensure that you're I would call it co-creation, right?
Yeah.
So who are the people that you're impacting? Who are the people that are involved in the project, and how do they get a say in, if your head office is in Germany or the Netherlands, but your, inputs don't
Yeah.
come from there, you do have a responsibility to co-create.
Great. Natalie, your thoughts on that distinction between these two kinds of initiatives, the big multinational platforms, and then what you're doing in a very direct impact way at Origin?
Well, I've been working for a multinational before, breaking down to startups, and the only constant in my origin is actually change. So your question is really difficult to answer because it's a daily change and uncertainty. The only certainty right now in Myanmar is that poverty is brewing up, wars are breaking out in all certain regions. So my statement here is all I wish for now and for the prospective future is stability and return of peace. When we talk about restoration, for us, it's the restoration of peace. And I think there are also lots of people in the audience from a coffee-producing country. There are lots of countries which are affected by war and peace. By war especially, the coffee belt is almost equal with the equator, and crises are brewing up around this place. Corruption, bribe, all bad things, actually. It's extremely difficult to work in a producing place. And what I hope for the future is that the coffee production places get more stability, and I believe it can be with the next generation with the, let's say, millionaire's mind to achieve success, be successful, maybe to overcome these political crises. So for me, the peace component is very important, and I hope that in 10 years I'll be here again, and that Myanmar and many other producing countries will be peaceful.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that. Ivy?
Your question is really very complex, I must confess.
Don't blame me,
Because
blame the person.
you're putting me in front of my potential bias. Just to start, Robusta is actually on the back burner when you come to the world of coffee. And the big players are already dealing with Arabica over and over and over. And in quite a recent time, I've heard about washed Robusta, which is great. And what I'm doing in my own little corner in Ghana is to create sustainability for my farmer and training in collaboration with certain organizations like CRIC, which is Ghana Research Institute, and the Cocoa Board, and with a lot of capacity training with ITC. By the time Robusta actually gain and be stabilized in the world of coffee, by that time we would have a specialty Robusta to also trade with the big boys. And also, with the front end of my brand, Café Magnifico, what I'm doing is to create innovative products that will keep making me competitive enough for when Robusta is having the fair playground.
Great. I mean, those are really great answers. And I haven't forgotten that I'm going to ask you. I know you already started, Natalie, to talk about the 5 to 10 year, but I'd like to dig into that one more time as we wrap up and connect it also to our theme of resilience and reinvention. But there's one other interesting question. If I could just get a very quick one-sentence answer. Someone has asked a question around how are you tracking the impact on the communities where you're working? Do you have like a special dashboard, or are you tied into certain KPIs, either maybe connected to your partners, or so just one quick thought from each of you. Maybe Ivy, I'll start with you. How do you measure the positive impact that you're having in those communities?
I measure my impacts in my communities by taking records on the number of kids that have been enrolled in school every year. It's because I have this charity give back to the community service that I do.
Yeah.
So with the smallholder farmers I deal with, they're my people. So I kind of have an interpersonal relationship with them.
Yeah.
And I check up with them to find out what are the impacts of the financial help I've been giving out. And also, they're small communities, so you can always find the data you're looking for. You don't need to be told Oli, and then you take that away with you. So, and me, I'm I like the ground. I like to be with the people. So I actually see the impacts of my works in the communities that I buy coffee from. And it's been tremendously well, because I've been able to enroll some students in school and giving the farmer a sustainable livelihood that increases the joy that they get from being with my cooperative, and then continuing to upgrade their farming practices and being in the farming, coffee farming sector.
I love that dashboard. I love those KPIs. Those are fantastic. Thank you, Ivy. Natalie, how are you setting out to measure impact in your project?
Social media is very big in our country, since there are lots of challenges to communicate in an isolated country. So Facebook, Instagram, and so on are really key to have a conversation with our producers. I can see arithmetically we get more likes or more followers, and those followers become influencer, get more likes. So just on an arithmetic basis of social media return. Secondly, yes, like I live in the plantations around, surrounded by producers. I see their living standard increasing. Together with the Swiss Development Agency, who was helping over 5 years, we took data in terms of return profit at the end of the year from producers. So we have this data in hand, and I hope in future also to be able to see the percentage of producer investing into roasting equipment, and track it in the future, and not lose track or sight of those producers.
So the actual economic transfer and the
Exactly.
investment. Yeah, got it. Thank you. Ludivine.
Yeah, so at the warehouse level, I think it's very clear, kilograms of waste equals kilograms of fertilizer equals kilograms of CO2.
Yeah.
So, that's clear. I think here it's the opportunity of social enterprises, and that's really when you bring, business with social impact, which means the better your business is doing, the better the impact. So, that's been an amazing opportunity to measure, and we measure it just like any other business would. Second, obviously at the farmer project level, that's quite different, because here we have clear KPIs. And I would add that sometimes that is the challenge of data in itself, because when you have funders and when you apply for grants and when you need funding, then everybody has their KPI and has their report that they need to feed you in. And so sometimes that can be the negative side of all of this grant funding and impact projects, is that it doesn't allow you to really be flexible or innovate in a moment where you realize maybe how you started a business or how you started a project is not actually the real impact. And so sometimes we're stuck creating an impact report for something that actually isn't the real impact that's happening on the ground anymore. And we have this whole other area of impact that is actually happening. But more concretely, we use an app. So we work with a local partner and Emira on the ground that already had extension workers, that already had a farmer project. And so we decided to just tap into that and just bring in innovation. So we're not a farming company. We're not a coffee company like these other two ladies. So for us, it was more about, how can we find the right partner to, give out our technology to. And so, we have a lot of data. And so now we're tracking 2,000 youth employed in 2 years. We're currently at 1,300, but it's very easy to track how many youth register in the system, how many youth buy our kits. Obviously, we can go out and check that at any time. And so we have annual checks as well.
Yeah.
And then it's also about, do they not only buy one kit, but do they actually come back and buy 4 kits? That's also an incredible impact.
Yeah. Fantastic. I love the breadth of different ways of understanding what impact is and what an organization can set out to achieve. So then, in one sentence, if I can really ask you to be very precise, 5 to 10 years' time, the next time you come onto this platform and you address this conference, how does the world look different? How does your world look different, personally, professionally, and in your organization? Natalie, you already started to touch on it a little bit, but what's your desire?
I mentioned one term, Asianizing. I believe in 10 years' time, and you might be shocked, but 50% will be Asian here. And maybe not 50% European in Asia. So my hope is that, and that's my key message tonight, is to leapfrog or to catch up from the European side to look into the new future, to follow the paradigm change of next generation, which is no any longer in South America, where we got all the aging demographics, but the future in Asia, and that's what I hope to see a better connectivity between the two continents.
Very clear, very good. Thank you. Ivy?
From 5 to 10 years from now, I wish and I hope to be able to put the Ghanaian Robusta in the world markets and the world of coffee, and also be an industry, a strong Robusta industry. I'm passionate about Robusta. I'm sorry, but I'm very passionate about Robusta. So I hope from 5 to 10 years now, I should have a specialty Robusta bean to be able to compete internationally and in the world of coffee.
Excellent. Great vision. Thank you, Ivy. Lily?
Honestly, I hope that in 5 to 10 years, companies have taken climate change seriously. I hope that they take responsibility for their own value chain. And I hope that we don't necessarily have to have a conference on sustainability, because it'll actually be integrated in how businesses operate.
Fantastic. I've got a couple of points of housekeeping, but before I do, I'd just like to ask anyone in the room here who's in some way able to support this work to come and talk to our panelists afterwards and find really concrete ways to support this really fantastic entrepreneurial pioneering work for impact. And I'd really like to thank all of you for sharing your story and showcasing that here at the event this year. So thank you all. Very good. And as I said earlier, and as a little plug for tomorrow morning, 10:30, I guess, in the same room, to 11:30, Next Generation Origin Women Leaders. And I think we've already had a taste of how exciting that can be, evolving the landscape of sustainability. There's a whole range of other events. It's all on the app. We have the keynote. I think that's at about 1 o'clock, where we have Michelle Burns of Starbucks. The only other thing to mention, I think, is the cocktails, which start in about 45 minutes at the Beau Rivage at 6:30. Thanks to everyone for being part of this today. Look forward to seeing you again tomorrow. Thank you. Thanks.